So, I've got something super interesting for you today. You know how we've been seeing all this crazy stuff happening in Eastern Europe lately?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's actually perfect timing to dive into this because, the whole situation with Eastern European defense capabilities is just, ah, it's absolutely fascinating right now.
I thought, given everything that's been happening, maybe we should really explore how countries like Poland and the Baltic states are, preparing themselves.
That's exactly what we need to talk about. Like, these countries, right? They're basically at the front line of what's happening in Europe right now. And the way they've been building up their defensive capabilities is just, it's honestly incredible.
For our listeners tuning into East Europe and its defense capabilities in front of rising Russian war machine, could you maybe give us a quick overview of why this is so important right now?
So look, what we're seeing is this massive shift in how these countries approach their defense, right? Like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. They're not just sitting around waiting anymore. They're actively, and I mean actively, strengthening their military capabilities. And it's all happening because, well, the geopolitical situation has just completely transformed in recent years.
I've noticed that there's been, a lot of news about military spending in these countries lately.
Oh my goodness, yes. The numbers are just, they're absolutely staggering. These countries are making some of the biggest defense investments we've seen since the end of the Cold War. And they're doing it because they understand something really fundamental, that the security landscape in Europe has totally changed.
So Adrian, I've been seeing these headlines about Poland's military spending, and it's kind of mind-blowing. What's actually happening there?
Anna, Poland is just, they're going absolutely all in on this. Like, they're making some of the biggest military investments in their entire history, and they're really not holding back at all.
Could you maybe, break down some of these investments for us?
So look, Poland has been on this absolutely massive spending spree, right? They've signed these huge deals with the US for things like F-35 fighter jets and Patriot missile defense systems. But that's not even the half of it. They've also made this incredible deal with South Korea for, like, we're talking about hundreds of K-2 tanks, K-9 howitzers, and F-A-50 light combat aircraft.
Those sound like, pretty serious purchases.
Oh, they absolutely are. And here's the thing that's really fascinating. Poland isn't just buying equipment, right? They're actually building this whole ecosystem of defense capabilities. Like, they're setting up maintenance facilities, training programs, and they're even getting technology transfers as part of these deals.
I've heard they're spending a really big percentage of their GDP on defense now.
That's exactly right. Poland is now spending like 4% of their GDP on defense, which is just, it's absolutely massive. That's way above the NATO requirement of 2%, and it makes them one of the biggest military spenders in Europe right now.
And what's driving all of this, investment?
So this is where it gets really interesting, right? Poland sits in this absolutely crucial strategic position. They're like, enough. They're right there on NATO's eastern flank, and they've got this long border with Belarus, which is basically a Russian ally at this point. So they're looking at their position and thinking, you know what, we need to be ready for anything.
What about their actual defense priorities?
Their priorities are just, they're super clear, really. First, they're focusing on territorial defense, right? Like making sure they can protect their borders and airspace. Then, and this is really important, they're working on mobility and rapid response capabilities. And they're also putting a huge emphasis on anti-tank and anti-aircraft systems because, well, they've learned some really important lessons from watching what's happening in Ukraine.
Speaking of defense strategies, what about the Baltic states? Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They're like right there on Russia's doorstep.
Oh, this is actually super fascinating because, Dias, like these three countries, they've developed this really unique approach to collective defense. And it's absolutely incredible how they work together, right? They've got this thing called BL-TRON, which is their joint naval force, and BALTNET for air surveillance.
So they're, working as a team to defend themselves?
Exactly. And here's what's really interesting. These countries, they're relatively small on their own, right? But together, and with NATO support, they've created this really sophisticated defense network. Like, they regularly conduct these joint military exercises, and they share intelligence, coordinate their procurement strategies.
I've heard something about, some special NATO units there.
Oh yes, absolutely. NATO has these enhanced forward presence battle groups in each Baltic state, and it's fascinating how this works. Germany leads the battle group in Lithuania, Canada in Latvia, and Britain in Estonia. And these aren't just symbolic forces, right? They're fully combat-ready units that train constantly with local forces.
What about their own military capabilities?
So that's really interesting because each country has its own specialties, right? Estonia is super strong in cyber defense, they're absolute pioneers in this field. Latvia has really focused on mechanized infantry and special operations. And Lithuania, they've been developing this rapid reaction force that can deploy just incredibly quickly.
How do they handle exercises together?
Well, they run these absolutely massive exercises, like BL Tops and Saberstrike, right? And what's really fascinating is how they integrate everything. They practice everything from cyber defense to conventional warfare, and here's the really cool part. They even coordinate with Finland and Sweden now, which just adds this whole new dimension to regional defense.
And their NATO membership? That's pretty important, right?
Oh my goodness, yes. It's absolutely crucial for them. Being part of NATO means they're under Article 5 protection, and they take this really seriously. They've been upgrading their military infrastructure, improving their host nation support capabilities, and they're constantly working to meet and exceed NATO standards. They're some of the most committed members of the alliance, and they really understand the importance of collective defense.
You mentioned infrastructure upgrades. What's actually happening on the ground in these countries?
Oh, this is really exciting, actually, because we're seeing just massive improvements across the entire region. Poland has been absolutely leading the charge with these incredible new facilities. They've been building and modernizing these bases that can support both their own forces and NATO allies.
What kind of facilities are we talking about?
So, they're developing these really sophisticated air bases, right? And they're creating these new storage facilities for military equipment. And what's really fascinating is how they're upgrading their ports to handle more NATO ships. And in the Baltic states, they've been doing this amazing work on their military training grounds.
Is this, all in response to recent threats?
Absolutely. You know what's really interesting? These countries, they've been totally accelerating their infrastructure development since 2014. And it's just kicked into high gear recently. They're building new command centers, improving their radar systems, and what's really crucial is they're upgrading their transportation networks.
Transportation networks? How does that fit in?
Oh, this is such a critical point. They're improving their roads, railways, and bridges to handle heavy military equipment, right? And they're creating what we call these military mobility corridors that allow rapid deployment of forces across the region. It's absolutely fascinating how detailed this planning is.
And what about their actual readiness? How prepared are they?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because they've made these incredible strides in readiness. They've shortened their response times dramatically, and they're maintaining much higher levels of combat readiness than ever before. They've got these new early warning systems, improved ammunition stocks, and what's really impressive is how they've integrated civilian infrastructure into their defense planning.
What do you mean by civilian infrastructure?
So imagine this. They're actually working with civilian airports, ports, and even hospitals to ensure they can support military operations if needed, right? And they've been hardening their critical infrastructure against both physical and cyber threats. It's this really comprehensive approach that takes into account every possible scenario.
So with all these improvements we're seeing, what role does NATO actually play in all of this?
Oh my goodness. NATO's role is it's absolutely fundamental to everything that's happening in Eastern Europe right now. Since 2016, they've established what they call the Enhanced Forward Presence. And it's this amazing initiative where NATO allies maintain these combat-ready battle groups in Poland and each of the Baltic states.
What exactly do these battle groups do?
So these battle groups are they're incredible, right? They're multinational units. And they're conducting constant training exercises, maintaining this 24/7 readiness. What's really fascinating is how countries like the US, UK, Germany, and Canada are each leading different battle groups. And they're not just sitting there, they're actively integrating with local forces, sharing expertise, testing new tactics.
How much support are these countries actually getting from NATO?
It's massive, honestly. We're talking about billions in military aid, right? And what's really interesting is how it's not just about money. NATO's providing this comprehensive package of support that includes advanced air defense systems, intelligence sharing, and what's really crucial is the regular deployment of air policing missions over Baltic airspace.
Are there any specific programs that stand out?
Oh, absolutely. Like there's this incredible program called the NATO Security Investment Program, and it's been funding these vital infrastructure projects across the region. What's really exciting is how they're building new facilities, upgrading military bases, and you know what's fascinating? They're even helping these countries develop their own cyber defense capabilities.
How does all this international cooperation actually work on the ground?
So this is really where the magic happens. You've got these joint training exercises happening constantly, right now. And they're not just small-scale operations. We're talking about massive exercises like Defender Europe that involve thousands of troops from multiple countries. What's really amazing is how seamlessly these different military forces work together, sharing equipment, coordinating strategies. It's just this incredible demonstration of allied unity.
But have there been any challenges with this coordination?
Well, you know what's interesting? There are always some hurdles when you're dealing with multiple militaries, different languages, different equipment standards, right? But, and this is what's really impressive, they've developed these sophisticated interoperability protocols. And what's really working well is how they've established these joint command structures that help overcome these challenges.
So after everything we've discussed today, what do you think are the biggest challenges these countries still face?
Oh, wow, that's such a crucial question. You know, despite all the progress we've seen, there are some really significant challenges ahead. Like first and foremost, there's this constant need to keep modernizing their equipment, right? And what's really challenging is how quickly military technology is evolving.
What about the costs involved? That must be pretty significant.
Absolutely, and that's actually one of the biggest hurdles they're facing. I mean, maintaining these defense capabilities is just, it's incredibly expensive. And what's really interesting is how these countries are having to balance their military spending with other national priorities. Like Poland's doing better because they have a larger economy, but for the Baltic states, it's really putting a strain on their budgets.
And what about their ability to respond to different types of threats?
That's such a crucial point. Because, you know, the threats they're facing are they're becoming more and more complex. What's really challenging is how they need to prepare for everything from conventional military threats to cyber attacks, hybrid warfare, and even energy security has become this massive defense concern.
Do you see any positive developments on the horizon?
Oh, absolutely. What's really exciting is how these countries are increasingly working together, sharing resources, and developing these joint capabilities. And what's particularly promising is the way they're attracting more international support and investment in their defense sectors. Like, they're not just buying equipment anymore, they're actually developing their own defense industries.
So what's your final take on their security outlook?
You know what? Despite all the challenges, I'm really optimistic about their future security situation. What's incredibly encouraging is how far they've come in such a short time. And what really stands out is their determination and unity. These countries understand exactly what they're up against, and they're just absolutely committed to maintaining their independence and security. Like, they're not just surviving, they're actively shaping their own defense future, and that's just remarkable.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode of East Europe and its defense capabilities in front of rising Russian war machine. Thank you all for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
And thanks, everyone. Keep following this fascinating region. There's always something new developing here.